Hey everyone, I've been wanting to start a series on my channel for the longest, or I've just had this need or itch to create a series talking about books, what I've been reading, and I wanted to make this first video going over all of the books that I've been reading over the past year or so. Not all of them, but just ones that I found interesting or worthwhile or something memorable about them that I can share in this video. So I'm not an expert scholar, I'm not an authoritative literary critic, and these are not necessarily my recommendations to you and everyone. This is just stuff that caught my interest and different curiosities and what I think about them. So I guess a good place to start is how or why I even read, or how it developed into such a big habit. TV, internet, social media, that's all only been around for this lifetime of ours, and so you're only getting a small sliver of thought and ideas, and also you only have your one life, so you can only have your kind of experience and background and family and friends. However, in books you get to kind of sit down and have a conversation with, or go through the mind or story of something you'd never be able to do in your one life. You kind of get to live a bunch of lives. Just sit here and just think about, like in philosophy, like what a chair is and if a chair really exists. But if I really think about it, I guess it kind of seems like the most worthwhile thing to think about, because we're all just here living, going about our daily business. It's kind of crazy that we can all just go about our daily business and everything just works. However, nobody knows how the heck any of this works. Why don't we actually get through talking about some of the books? Kind of going along with what I just talked about, I read a good bit of stuff on books about books, so like how to read and why, how to read literature like a professor. There was another one, I got rid of it, or I don't have it anymore, but it was how to read a book. It's just called How to Read a Book. And this kind of also gets into how do I find what to read. So it starts out with just one interest, but one book leads to another, and one author mentions each other, and everybody's kind of in conversation with each other, and you slowly get familiar with all the names and interests and pick things up. Another thing you run across a lot is poetry, which I wanted to understand a little bit more. So I also got this one here, or I also read this one, A Poetry Handbook, which is also kind of like a book about books. It's a book about poetry and what makes up poetry. So one of the first things I started to get really interested in was philosophy and the history of philosophy, and kind of working up from there. So I never thought I'd be reading a textbook for fun, but this isn't the only thing I read. This is a history of Western philosophy. I haven't read this whole thing, but there's also tons of history of philosophy books. When I was first starting out, it was really confusing to figure out all this, like where to start and how it all builds upon each other. A lot of Western philosophers also incorporate Eastern philosophy in some of their stuff too, so it's not all separate. So from there I started reading the dialogues of Plato, which I'm sure many of you maybe read in school, or if you were a philosophy major. Maybe I should have been a philosophy major. It's funny, I'm finally able to read all these once I'm done with my obligations of school. You probably are somewhat familiar with the name Socrates, which is a character that, Socrates never actually wrote anything down, but he's in Plato's dialogues, basically going around trolling the townspeople, just continually asking them to explain stuff and tripping them up. You have the Republic, which is probably his most core or essential work. This one I'm still working through, but I've read about half of these dialogues. They're not as difficult as you might think. They're just dialogue, kind of like almost a play of a bunch of characters kind of debating each other, and Socrates being the one kind of going around being skeptical of everyone and asking them to prove or asking them why they believe certain things that they do. And I could see why it's a good start in philosophy, because it just gets you to start thinking about what and why. Plato has ideas of his own and theories of his own, and this was really worthwhile because it's, as you'll see, all of these things kind of build upon each other and people reference back to these ideas and maybe challenge them or come up with their own or agree with them or reference them. So there's tons of things that are referenced in later years through this. Going along with that, I also just wanted to get more familiar with some of those things. A lot of Greek plays and Greek literature are constantly referenced throughout philosophy and psychology. Sophocles, Oedipus complexes, things like that. This is actually the complete plays of Aristophanes. These are actually comedies. So Aristophanes apparently wrote 30-something odd plays that we know about, but only 11 of them are surviving that we actually have. And they're quite funny. They're actually still pretty funny. You'd think ancient stuff is ancient and all antiquated, but it's fresh, it's humorous. There's lots, and another one in here that ties in with the Plato. Socrates is also mentioned in other writers like Aristophanes. The play The Clouds has a humorous mocking or portrayal of Socrates. He's also mentioned in another writer's work, which I haven't got to, which is Xenophon. Also did like his own recordings of Socrates. Another kind of reference book, Edith Hamilton, Mythology. This is just all Greek mythology, like Zeus and Midas touch and all those things which it helps to be familiar with. Another one, some plays. So, I went to the used bookstore, I picked up all the stuff that I could find like that. There's just chock full of references. Prometheus, fire, all these famous stories. I feel like I'm slowly subjecting myself to probably some kind of university course in Greek literature or literature in general would be. It can honestly get kind of tiring to just stick in one time period, so you do bounce a lot. Something I guess that still goes with that is the school of Stoic philosophy. So here I have Seneca's letters, Epictetus, and there's also Marcus Aurelius. Those are like the big three Stoic philosophers, which I already read a lot of Marcus Aurelius' Meditations when I was going through that businessy phase. It's honestly still good stuff. This stuff has been kind of co-opted by, you'll see a lot of business books that are using Stoicism or like repackaging Stoicism in a way. And I just feel like you might as well just read the original texts because they're pretty easily accessible, and Stoicism is just kind of how to go with the flow and live by nature, if you want to call it that. I guess that's why it's been so popular in business and these trends like minimalism that have come up, because it kind of ties in with minimalism and stuff like that. But I promise we're going to get to more fun stuff as we go forward. As you can see, I took myself through a bit of a journey here, but this is like a year and more's worth of stuff that I've been reading. Another thing that I found this at a thrift store. It seemed interesting. This is Huston Smith, World's Religions. This is like a big illustrated version. I normally don't like these. They don't really fit nicely on any shelf, but you always run across a few of them. Just reading about different world religions and getting familiar with those is another thing that I've been really curious about and interested in. Going along with that, I'm also reading through the Bible. This in itself could be like a whole library of, I think there's like 50, 60 something books in here. But I feel like without having read this, I would be partially illiterate in a sense of, this is probably one of the most influential books throughout countless other books, movies, music, just schools of thought. So it's something I felt like I owed myself to sit there and actually go through from start to finish. But obviously I haven't done that yet. But some more philosophy books I'm jumping through and in and out of. If you get into philosophy, you're without a doubt going to hear the name Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, and he's probably one of like the most famous, polarizing, or I guess you could say. He has a certain aura around him. I have most of his works on my shelf, but I read Beyond Good and Evil. Many people said that this is a good starting point because some of his stuff can be, I think you need a lot of context about his stuff. There's a good biography about him by Walter Kaufman, who also has famous translations of most of his work, which I probably think I should read that and then continue reading through some more of his works. I read some of another one, Human All Too Human, which is like one of his first ones. But I feel like I didn't have much. I feel like I don't have the complete picture yet. So from reading Nietzsche, you also read that he had this kind of mentor, or he was inspired in a way, but later came to reject or build upon the ideas of this guy, Arthur Schopenhauer, who this guy seems to have influenced a lot of people, but I quite enjoyed this probably more than Nietzsche. It's just easier to pick up. This is a slim volume that's just little like essays on different topics and little aphoristic like bits of wisdom. But maybe because there was a really good introductory essay by the translator in the beginning of this that goes over the context of who he's responding to, or like building upon the ideas of another German philosopher, Immanuel Kant, who I haven't gotten to either. But you see, it all gets pretty confusing and they all build upon each other. Very pessimistic stuff, which I'm not saying there's not truth to what he's saying, but I don't know if you're supposed to read it this way, but for me, it was quite humorous. Like just some of the little anecdotes. Reading some of the anecdotes about him in the intro was almost just as entertaining or interesting as reading his actual essays, which were also great. Just stuff like he didn't get along with anybody. There's one little bit in here about him that describes how he would always go for a walk no matter what. He would go for I forgot what it was, like an hour walk or 2 hour walk. But every day he would always go for a walk no matter what the weather was outside. And not necessarily because he was a health fanatic or some reason. It was just out of pure obstinance or like pure stubbornness that he would go out a walk. It was like he would impose his will and he wouldn't let nature impose its will on him. So I'd probably like to pick up some of his larger and more difficult works. Another branch of philosophy I jumped around into was Existentialism, The Stranger by Camus, and also The Myth of Sisyphus. There goes the Greek mythology references that I was talking about. I also got interested in trying to brush up on a few language skills. Picked some of these language books up, speaking Spanish, Latin proverbs, and Latin books. These are stuff that I just found at library sales. Again, how I'm getting all these, probably the majority of all the books that I have I got used, and usually only for like a few bucks. A lot of times if I got them from the thrift store, sometimes they would even do like 10 cents for one. So only ones that I can't find or really want I would get on Amazon or buy new. So it's a hobby that's not really not as expensive in money as it is in time that you're investing. Alright, let's jump into, I guess, a little bit more modern times. Maybe some more nonfiction stuff rather than all this ancient stuff. One author that I've been reading this year, I can't necessarily say that I've been enjoying his writing style completely, but I enjoy the ideas underneath it that he's presenting and talking about, is Nassim Taleb. And he has this whole series of books called Incerto, I believe. You can get them all packaged together. It's like 5 books. I suppose you could consider these business books, but they're not really. They're more like philosophical, economic books about the ideas about risk, randomness, and uncertainty, which is a branch of, this is a topic that I'm interested in. Like, what can we know as humans and what can we not know? He writes in a kind of way that it might remind me of like one of your uncles that goes on and on and on about a certain subject. This is one idea that I really liked from this, how we're better at making up stories about why things happened, but we can't really predict. It's easy to look back and say, oh yeah, that happened because there was this and that and that, and that's why the stock market crashed. It was obvious. But we couldn't really do that if we looked forward in the future. And a lot of stuff in this I didn't want to agree with. Like, you want to think, oh yeah, of course I got all these subscribers on YouTube because I worked hard and I did this and that. But then when you think about it, I guess for me it's like, what gives me the capability to work hard, or what gives me the intelligence, or, you know, it's just not as an excuse, but there really is so much randomness that's out of our hands that we don't think about, and we look back and try to act like we understood this perfect sequence of events. So yeah, I read Fooled by Randomness. I'm kind of just reading them in chronological order. I'm reading through The Black Swan right now, and I read The Bed of Procrustes, which is like philosophical aphorisms. This is actually supposedly his, or seems like his most well-known and popular work, which I haven't gotten to yet. Another idea I really like in here is the idea of an anti-library and anti-knowledge. I mean, you have with minimalism and Stoicism, it always talks about getting rid of all your stuff, but I kind of like the idea of this, of the idea that an unread book on your shelf and all the unread books on your shelf are actually much more valuable than all the ones that you've read already, because you've already read those ones. I mean, of course, rereading some stuff lends itself to rereading. Yeah, it just helps me justify hoarding books. So, well, yeah, I do think it's good to remember, or have at your fingertips at least, all the stuff that you might be ignorant and curious about. If you only have 10 books on your shelf, you might only read half of them, but if you have like 100 books on your shelf, you also might only read half of them. Another like nonfiction, financial, economic type of book that I read was Digital Gold. It's just a journalistic approach through, it takes you through the story of Bitcoin from its inception and all the key players all the way till I think when this book was released. It's not like a fanatical book about why you should buy Bitcoin. The guy who wrote it is actually skeptical of it. It's just a journalistic approach. And another interest or curiosity that developed for me this lately was like economics and finance, and just the idea of what money is. We all use it every day, but if you really sit down and think about what it actually is, and like different forms of money that different people have, different cultures and different tribes of people have had in the past, like how there have been stones and beads used as money. Aside from this, I read a bunch of there's lots of great online articles in this space about the history of money, and I just think it's a really interesting topic, because just like my interest in languages, money itself is kind of like a language. And it's not necessarily that like I'm on some Bitcoin hype train. This has also gotten me to read about different schools of thought about economics. So books about capitalism and books about critiques about capitalism. But economics in itself is just as vast of a thing as all these philosophy books that I've showed you, and it's kind of a philosophy of its own. If you look at that, we're getting cleared up here. Also read the biography of Elon Musk by Ashley Vance. I just found Elon Musk to be like a really interesting figure of our day, so I just wanted to read, kind of get a more humanized account of him, and that was a good one. I like that one. Lastly, in more biographies that I read, this is kind of probably a personal to me interest, is one of my favorite musicians, Jeff Buckley. I noticed that this book got released pretty recently by one of his managers. If you're not familiar with Jeff Buckley, he passed away in, I think, 1997 at, I believe he was only 30, or he was pretty young, and he tragically drowned, and he inspired a lot of other of my favorite artists. But aside from that, I started listening to him a long time ago when I was a teenager, just off some recommendation that I saw online or something, and I just continually have gone back to his work over the years for like maybe 10 years now, and it still is fresh, and I still keep going back to it and back to it and back to it. It's not someone that I would have suspected would slowly turn into one of my favorite artists to continually go back to. I kind of have just been reading everything I can about him. There's another book, Dream Brother, of him and his father. His father was also a somewhat famous or cult musician, and he also tragically passed away when he was young from a drug overdose, I believe. Jeff Buckley, you may be familiar with him from his famous cover of Hallelujah, but to me, his music, although he died so young and didn't leave much behind, a lot of his songs were covers of, but it was such an eclectic mix of things like Nina Simone all the way to the Smiths to Led Zeppelin, and he turned me on to a lot of music and a lot of things and inspirations that I like now. And I guess the older I get, now that I'm probably the age that he was when he was writing a lot of this stuff, I also got this big book that just got recently released too, of like just his notebooks and stuff like that, and I just can relate to it more and more, like his notebooks in here about his wanting to make it, and like his urge to make it and change the music scene and change the music industry, and his struggles with the ghost of his father, which he didn't really know much. Maybe in this little experiment to see how much I can truly read about one single artist, I will get tired of his music for a while. But to me, beyond just the music and the live performances and this small body of work that he put together, I guess the other thing is like just the tragedy of it all that makes whatever he did leave behind all so much more valuable, I guess, which is kind of a shame that when people die, we revere them more. But he died when I was a kid, so yeah, I really don't normally like big, sometimes can be gimmicky books like this, but this one's really good. I like it. Probably, I mean, I'm not going to recommend that you go read it, but I've had a long interest in listening to his music for many, many years, and so if you want to get a little bit meta here, he was also quite poetic and literarily inspired, like the poetry of Arthur Rimbaud, which I found a copy of at my used bookstore, which he seems quite popular and has inspired artists like Jeff Buckley, but more famous artists like Bob Dylan and whatnot. So yeah, that's just another anecdote into how you can stumble upon different works and authors and writers, and how eventually your library just becomes full of different curiosities that you pick up. I could probably make a whole separate video about Jeff Buckley, but that's fun to talk about music on this channel. I never really get to do that. Japanese authors that I've been reading. I read Yukio Mishima, The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea. This is just about a sailor who docks onto shore in this town and kind of gets into a relationship with this woman and her sneaky, crazy, edgy child, and his group of friends kind of have other plans. Probably the one that I enjoyed the most, though, was this one, No Longer Human. This is another book about just a guy who just can't really relate with other people. He plays the clown in front of other people, but it's an interesting story. It's like a little vignettes of his life from when he was younger to older, how he spirals out of touch in a way. And it's kind of interesting to get an insight into Japanese culture in these kind of ways through literature. It's cool to see the similarities that just people in general share, no matter where they're from. Another novel that I really liked is Stoner by John Williams. This is like one of those sleeper hits that nobody really knew about at first, but now it's like famous for not being as well known of a classic. I also love these New York Review Book Classic paperbacks. That sounds like such an advertisement, but no, you start to appreciate publishers who use nice acid-free paper, nice covers, and not like thick floppy pages. It's like a nice condensed book. This is the story of a poor farmer boy kind of who his parents send him off to college to study agriculture, but he somehow falls in love with literature instead and becomes a teacher, and how in the progression of his life. It's kind of a sad story. It's not sad to me, but his life is not everything goes the way. Basically, nothing goes his way, but through the telling of the story, the author shows you this guy who nothing really is going his way as you think, but yet there's still something endearing about him, and there's still, because nobody else can see it, but you, the reader, can see this guy, and so you build up a lot of respect and kind of endearment towards him, and it just has that cozy atmosphere of being set in a college setting. Kind of, if you like the movies like Good Will Hunting and Dead Poets Society, it doesn't have anything to do necessarily with those storylines, but if you just like that cozy university aesthetic, this would be interesting to you. And if you like books about books, kind of, this gets meta in that way because he becomes a teacher of literature. So it sounds really boring, but it was actually a great read, something I could get through in a couple days, just a couple sittings. A page turner, if you will, but yet nothing that exciting really happens. But it's just kind of cool how, despite all this stuff that's going on in this person's life, they can constantly return back to books and this different world in reading. The longest book I read, and I read it earlier than a lot of this other stuff, is The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas. This is a classic. You've probably all heard of it. Maybe you've seen the movie versions. This is the unabridged version. There's lots of abridged versions, but I like this translation that Penguin Classics offers by Robin Buss. Great story, door stopper book. It's kind of like an episodic TV show. I believe he got paid by the chapter, and this was released in installments in like a local paper or like a newspaper or something, or a magazine. And it definitely, he doesn't hesitate to draw it on and on and on. But the main storyline of revenge and betrayal is pretty classic, enjoyable, worthwhile read. And then lastly, these are just some things that I have my bookmark in now. So this is what I usually keep on here. Just a couple books that I have my bookmark in now. If you made it all the way to the end here, please let me know what you thought about any of this. So I hope to keep this series going now that I've gone through this backlog. Maybe once a month or once every couple weeks, or just whenever I feel like a certain topic, specific videos on maybe just one author or one book, or just what I've been reading in 1 month or something. So thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one.